What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Compile Swift podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and here's the other host, Jeff. How you doing, Jeff?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good.
Awesome. We're doing something a little different this week, folks. We are recording live in front of a text audience, and we all know how opinionated the internet is, so we will see how this goes. But we wanted to bring some folks in, because we're going to talk about something that can be a little controversial sometimes, pricing. And thankfully, neither of us are experts. Let's just put that up front right there. Do not take us for financial advice, or any advice for that matter. But we do have opinions. Oh, how lucky you are. And we're gonna
another thing the internet has plenty of.
Yeah, because, we thought two more are needed. Clearly there are two missing, right? So we are as correct as everybody else is what we're thinking here. So just to give a little overview here for folks, we're going to cover this from all directions and take questions from the chat room as they come up. Now, we're going to cover pricing in a very general way here because, let's be clear, there are no right or wrong answers. There are only the answers that work for you. And so we're going to base this on some of our own experiences, folks we know, and hopefully some good old common sense. So let's dive in here and let's start by, how we got here. How did we get here to talk about this? Go for it, Jeff.
Yeah. So there's a personal aspect to why we're talking about this week, and there's also a more public aspect as to why we're talking about this week. Well, actually, last week I released my iOS app, Bark, my newest iOS app. It is perhaps controversially a subscription-only app at this time. I posted a video about this on YouTube and had a lot of comments about that very thing. A couple days after I released my app, Bark, somebody much more famous and much more popular on YouTube than myself, Mr. MKBHD, released his app, Panels. Also a subscription-heavy, although not subscription-only app, and we can get into some of the difference there, and was also very heavily excoriated for the pricing around his app. And so there's blood in the water, as it seems. And so we wanted to, maybe spill a little bit more.
To sort of put a little perspective here, right? And I think that it might be healthy to put this at the very beginning so folks know where we're coming from. I have some free apps in the Apple App Store, and I have a paid app in the Apple App Store. So I have it tried both ways. Now, I don't have subscriptions, but thankfully, like you say, you do. So I feel like I at least have a valid opinion since I've got two of the three there. Now, we should start by saying, and I think it's fair to say, let's first of all congratulate you because you put a video out there and it went extremely well. I won't use the words that you used. This is a public show, folks, to describe how well it went and your surprise. But it generated a hell of a lot of comments, right? Yeah. And I know that at one point, I think you said to me, I just can't keep up with responding. Well, first of all, congratulations, because that's the kind of thing you want, right? I mean, it's shocking when it happens. But this is where a lot of this comes from. So I think we should start with you.
Let's set a level on how many things you are, because you said you have two of the three. I count four because you said free app, paid app, which I think this is where the fourth one is coming, subscription app, paid up front versus in-app purchase.
Good point. Yes, and
I don't even. Yours is yours paid up front. I'm misremembering.
Mine is paid up front.
Okay. Yes. So you have.
Yeah. Well, free. It will be when somebody does.
There you go. You have free and paid up front. I have free.
Yes.
In-app purchase and subscriptions. I have no paid up front ones.
Okay. All right. Yeah, you caught me. I've been secretly hoarding my millions from the App Store. Yeah.
No, but I think that that is I think that's a distinction worth making. Like, is there a difference between paid up front and one-time purchase, one-time in-app purchase?
Yes, you're quite right, because arguably some folks would say, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but paid up front to me, you don't get nothing until you've paid for it. Then you get the app, and hey, if it works out, great. And if it doesn't work out, well, there is you have a recourse there in the App Store. as opposed to the other method, which I often think of as, we don't use the word trial, in the App Store, right? We have evaluate it for a little while, and then either pay to expand it in some way, or perhaps more controversially, pay to continue using it without actually using the word trial, right?
Yep.
Now, so I tell you what, let me talk about my thoughts on that for a second then,
Okay.
right? Because I feel like in some ways it's Apple that has forced that situation with their policies. And I'm not saying whether I agree or disagree with them. I'm just saying that I think that it's, it's the only way for people to try out software on an iPhone, on an iPad, on a watch. I guess Vision OS at this point. I don't know. I don't have one. Without having the ability to try it in some other way. Okay, yes, the European App Store is changing that. But let's not bring that in and make it, harder to get through than it is. So because of the way that it works with their policies, right, there's no other way for me to evaluate software beforehand other than some, in air quotes, light version. Unlike, say, Mac, Windows, Linux, where it's like, hey, go download it, try it. If you like it, great, go buy it from the App Store, right? And I think at some point, something like that does need to happen for, iPhone, iPad. But I would imagine that's incredibly complicated to
It's been
figure
16
out.
years. I don't think they're going to change anything.
Right. And, I think there's value in Apple saying, well, it's working out great for us. Okay, leave it at that. Now, okay, the way this might change with these third-party app stores, anyone that's got Android would be familiar with the phrase side loading. It's kind of like that a little bit, I guess. But hey, I'm not in the European app stores. I've not looked into it, so I don't want to, comment on that. But that's how I see those two different payment mechanisms, right? One, pay it on good faith, and then the other one, try it out to some degree, and then pay to continue using it or expand the features that you want.
Yep.
So that's my take on that. What do you think of those?
I think that's correct. Like the problem with paid upfront is exactly what you say, is that you are asking people to take it on faith. That you are saying, hey, here is my app. I've told you what I can through 3,000 characters or whatever the description is, and 5 screenshots, and maybe a 30-second video. If you are, I was going to say, if you're a large company, maybe you can get away with that. But even a lot of the large companies today, you think your Adobe's, your Microsoft's, your whatevers, they are also moving towards this subscription status. And I think that is very much part of why they are doing this, is that even they cannot trade entirely on their brand name anymore. That they have to say, like, there have been enough companies, themselves included, who have said, hey, we've got this software. We think you're really going to like it. You're going to have to pay up for it up front. And it turns out the software is garbage. And I think that, unfortunately, it is a reality that you have to give people a chance to try before they buy.
Hey folks, if you like what you're hearing in this podcast and you want to help this podcast to continue going forward and having great guests and great conversations, I invite you to become a Patreon supporter. You can go to patreon.com/CompileSwift, where you will get ad-free versions of the podcast along with other content. There's a certain amount where you say, I'll just pay that, we'll see what happens, right? And it's acceptable is what I'm going to call it. And then there are pricing structures and breakpoints where you say, to pay that, I expect a certain level of, I hate to use the word professional software, but hopefully everyone knows what I mean, right? There's a certain expectancy. And, I'm glad that we see that now because, that first category, what I call sort of the 99-cent thing, right? If you pay that, it's throwaway in many ways, right? Especially if you equate it to everyone does cup of coffee, something like that, right? You don't buy a cup of coffee and then expect to have another one given to you free because you paid for that one, right? So for 99 cents, hey, I get what I get. And if it's terrible, okay, I'm going to be cautious next time on that developer, right? But then there, and I want to say for me, it was things like when OmniFocus and that came to the iPhone, there was this next tier of what I call we are finally reaching desktop quality software with the appropriate price, right? Because, some apps, whatever you want to, I'm using OmniFocus because that was the first one I remember paying over the odds, appropriate pricing for. But I knew that I was getting an app of that quality, right, based on history. Now, that's how I see it. Other folks may disagree, and let's be clear, right? If something's free, I think you absolutely get what you get, and it's it's one of those that it's like, hey, you're walking into this, it's of no cost to you. If it sucks, it sucks. If it's great, it's great. By all means, give it a review, but you're not, I'm going to use the word entitled in any way because you haven't paid for anything. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I would not agree that people feel that way, but that makes sense.
Well, I'm not saying they do. I'm just saying that I think from a perspective, it's, hey, you get something for free. You don't have to take it, right? But if you're paying something, you are choosing to take it for some cost at that point.
Yeah.
Nobody's made you do it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I think that there is an expectation of a higher deliverable if you are asking for money for something. That if you have asked people to fork over the bucks, as it were, they are expecting a return on that investment. And I think that does ultimately get into where we start seeing the split between one-time payments, whether upfront or in-app purchase, and subscriptions. Because what is the level of what people expect over time and what they expected for that money? And this is where we get into where my feelings have been a little bit mixed recently. So historically, my apps have always been either free or one-time purchases. I've had a couple apps that have been completely free for a long time, and I've had my main two apps, Black Highlighter and Kineo, that are one-time permanent unlock features. And Kineo, it's been in the App Store for, depending on how you count, 16 or 5, 6, 7 years. I would have to actually double check that. And has gotten consistent free updates over that time. Heck, I released an entirely brand new rewritten version of it for Vision Pro. Black Highlighter has also been on the App Store for 7 years and has had a single price that entire time. And, has also continued to get decent updates every couple months for those 7 years. And the problem, I think, comes when people continue to expect that your app continues to work, continues to have new features, continues to get bug fixes, all of that, and they may have paid for it once in 7 years. And as a developer, that stops becoming sustainable over time. There is only so much that I can continue to provide having gotten $2-3 from you one time in 7 years. And I think that there's a level at which you saturate your market, for example, and you say, I've reached probably as many people as I can with Black Highlighter without going into being able to spend money on Apple search ads or anything like that. Where I have my market of people who do really like this app, but have supported it once in a long time. And I feel like I'm trying to walk this thin line here where I absolutely love that people have supported it as they have. And I don't want to sound ungrateful for that support. But at the same time, I know that I have people who do respond to me, to email me a number of times. And I go man, I am not, there's a level at which, the amount of time that I am putting into black highlighter is not being made up for the amount of work that is being seen from it. And sometimes that's things that are, you never knew. I mean, that was Kineo with Vision Pro. Like, that was absolutely a waste of my time. The other side of it is an app like Black Highlighter, where people are continuing to enjoy this over time and continue to request updates, continue to request, new features, that kind of thing. And it's just the time that I spend into it versus the amount that I get back is out of whack. And so that's why with Bark, I went the subscription route, where I was saying, you know what? I know that some of my apps get these quote unquote 1,000 true fans, and they get to a point where there are people who continue to use this app for years and years and years. And what I want to do is I want to try and better align what I get out of that with what they get out of that. And that was my goal with moving to a subscription model, was saying one-time payment doesn't work for me, has not worked for me for apps that I sustain for multiple years for in both cases. Like I think in both cases, each of those apps has had over 7 years of development done on them. And for some of my other apps, it's been a case where I've had to drop that app because it is just no longer financially viable for me to spend time on it. And to say, like, I am continuing to work on this app because I know what this is getting me. The problem that I see is that, like, the ultimate inciting event here is, like, Kineo is getting to that point where Kineo is not worth the amount of time that I put into it. And I don't want to drop Kineo. I don't want to stop making Kineo. I don't want to stop continuing to build Kineo. But I spent 6 months making that Vision OS app, and it went nowhere. I've had the iPad app for years, and I know that people love that iPad app, but it's not something that I can continue to work on for the amount of people and the amount of value that I see back out of that.
So I think I can help you out here. I think I can spin this so that I end up sounding like the bad guy. How does that help, right? Let me start with, I hope that consumers somehow decide to listen to this episode, because I'm going to use a couple of analogies here, right? I feel like it's only recently, over the past few years, with smartphones and everything, that consumers have started to understand software has value and requires maintenance and a certain level of expectation from the consumer. For many of them, this is kind of an unusual concept, right? Those that never, grew up perhaps heavily using computers in the conventional sense, right? So they've never really had to pay for software, right? Like we used to, box off the shelf kind of thing, right? And now that everyone's got one in their pocket, or most people have one in their pocket, they're starting to realize that, hey, guess what? There are running expenses to that $1,000 device you just bought. And by that, to give you an example here, kind of an equivalent, right? If you go buy a car, you've got the initial outlay for the car. Regardless of whether you're paying for it over time or whatever, the car costs X amount of money. Now, when you buy that car for X amount of money, you don't expect to get lifelong maintenance for free, right? You don't expect to get free wheels, free brakes, free services, and all these kind of things. You go into that knowing there's going to be some costs for me at some point down the road, right? You just don't get all that for free. And I think people need to think about software in that way now that they are using it every day for whatever reason, right? Just because it's not a physical thing that you can point at or pick up or something like that, it doesn't mean the value of it is any different, right? Am I making sense? Right? You're getting something, an initial cost, and along the way, it's going to cost you something, right? You buy the phone, for that matter. You're still going to pay a monthly phone bill to have a phone line, right? And those, well, okay, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but for the most part, right? All these kind of things, you have cable, you got whatever, electricity going to your house. And we are now moving into the kind of world where software is the same thing, right? Software as a service, right? I mean, it is something that has an ongoing cost. And so to then turn around as a consumer and say, I don't agree with these ongoing costs. Well, why is it perfectly okay to do that for your house, your car, your gas, your electricity, your phone? Why is it acceptable for all of those things, yet not acceptable for others, right? And that's kind of how I look at the services, right? And subscriptions over time. I've never had a problem with companies that charge subscriptions. If you look back, okay, Adobe was the first, arguably very well-known one. If you step outside of huge professional software houses for whatever, TV industry, whatever, who have been doing this for a very long time. If you stop and you think about it, right, let's take Adobe here for a second, right? I'm not going to go on a sidetrack here or anything, but we started off every year, we go out, we would buy the Creative Suite upgrade for whatever, $150, something like that, right? Now,
600. It was way more than 150.
Well, okay. For the initial purchase, yes, but the upgrade every year was like 150 for me. So I don't know. My point is, I was paying it out in one lump sum. That could just as easily have been spread over 12 months, and ultimately, I'm not saying it is the same, but you're really talking about the same kind of figures, right? And I think that just because people see it as an ongoing cost as opposed to a huge outlay at some point, they perceive that as being different in some way. So, just kind of putting that. All right, here it is. The one thing that I cannot do without every day, and that is my coffee. Anyone that knows me or anyone that's listened to any of my podcasts or anything else knows that I absolutely cannot operate without my coffee, and I love good coffee. So here's the deal. I'm going to give you one free bag of coffee by going to peterwitham.com/coffee. There is a wonderful company out there that follows the fair trade practices, helps out a lot of independent roasters of all sizes, and the operation is simple. What you do is you're going to go to peterwitham.com/coffee. You sign up there. You get a free bag of coffee sent to you. Yes, in return, they say thank you to me by giving me some coffee. But that's not the reason I'm doing this. The reason I'm doing this is because I have found so many good coffees that I just would never have come across, heard about, or experienced without this service. Trade Coffee is just fantastic. There are plenty of places out there. We all know them that supply coffee, good coffee. You can go to the store, get the coffee, but there is nothing better than discovering new independent roasters and supporting them, discovering new flavors of coffee, new grinds you can set it up. It's very smart. You tell it the kind of coffee you like, and over time it gets better and better as it trains in on your selections and your choices and gives you exactly the coffee you're looking for and recommending new ones that will be very similar. Every time I get a new packet of coffee, I go through, and afterwards I try the coffee. I go through the service and I say, look, I loved this coffee. I thought this coffee was okay. Or I say, look, this was really not for me. And every time I do that, it makes the service a little more accurate on the next selection for me. So again, just go to peterwitham.com/coffee. Get your free bag of coffee today. If you're a coffee lover, you're going to really appreciate this service. I have been using it for years at this point and thoroughly recommend it. Perspective there.
Yeah. So I have three responses, and I realize that I'm immediately going to be basically turning around and arguing against my own points here, but this is kind of the thoughts that I've been having over the past week and a half, of where I am kind of constantly arguing against myself in the same way. One, we have a response from somebody in the chat who points out and says that they see fewer complaints about subscriptions if there's an obvious ongoing server cost. And I see that, and I agree with that. I do see that there are people who are saying that, hey, they're looking at my app, for example, and saying, well, there's no obvious ongoing cost to me. And they're they're wanting to see where kind of this money is going. And they don't really see where this money is going in the sense of ongoing maintenance. So that's point one. Point two is I agree with the idea of, and I've seen a lot of people say the same sort of thing as well, of, you know, why don't you just bundle up an update and then, you know, there'll be a big update and you release this big update and people will buy that. That is not really a thing that Apple allows. And this is a case where their stranglehold over the App Store is kind of cutting off certain business models. And that is one of them, where they are saying that, you know, you can't really do paid upgrades very well in the App Store. But B, and this is where I'm coming with this argument from a consumer perspective, is if I am making an app that I need to have a major update that you really want to go and buy, what does that mean? That means I've built features, I've made bug fixes, I've done whatever, and I'm telling you, no, you can't have it for 12 months because I need to hold this back for a big update that is going to get a bunch of news and that people will see and they'll go, oh, it's worth it for me to put that bucks out again and pull out my wallet again. And that is not really beneficial to you as a consumer. It's not even really beneficial to me as a developer, where I'm saying, you know, I'm going to tick everybody off for 12 months because I'm just saying, you know, here, I don't want to release this app because I'm holding this back for my own greed to say, here's a big update later. I would rather be shipping improvements constantly. Three, I guess. No, this is going back up a bullet. 3, I think we as developers have to realize that no matter what these arguments we want to make to consumers and say like, oh, consumers have to think of this way, they're not. And we kind of have to react to that regardless of, do we wish that consumers would really see this our way and that we really think that, you know, they should be understanding these arguments that we're making? And the fact of the matter is, like, no, people have their own reasons for doing what they want. They have their own understandings of the value that they are being provided, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, while we might wish that consumers understood this maintenance burden that we have, they don't. And we can't expect them to. And so what are we doing in response to that? And how are we going to react to that is really the question that I feel like I am struggling with on my own.
The right answers for each of us are the ones that each of us feel comfortable with, right? And I want to touch on that point there in a second, but I also want to respond to a couple of things here in the chat before they go too far, because I think they deserve answers. So in the chat room here, and I'm just going to quote this one quickly, following the car ownership analogy, wouldn't this indicate that customers are more likely to understand the cost of software if significant app updates cost money? And my answer to that is yes. And you do see, right, I can't think of one to name offhand, but there are apps where they essentially give you the point updates for free, meaning that you've paid for the original one and you get those. And then they say, okay, and they spin up a new, well, I guess it would be App ID, right, for the next major version that you then pay for, and you can choose to get that new version, or you can stay with the old one, and they make it clear, okay, we're not going to do any more point updates on this, you know, and so eventually, logically, it'll stop working once whatever OS version stops supporting something in that app, right? Which is always, you know, again, I don't think that's the fault of the developer. That's an inherent risk of, hey, you know, time goes by, right? So you can do that, but also as as they note here in the chat room, yeah, it's not easy to do either, right? And it does get complicated because users think, wait a minute, I got version 1, now you want me to pay for version 2 and so on. But I think if you're honest and upfront and explain it as best as you can to the customer, I think that's perfectly acceptable. And I think it's a good way to try and deal with that. But I do agree with the comments in the chat room that, you know, the current model of the App Store does not make that easy from a publisher's perspective. Not at all. right? So there is that. But I also wanted to comment on, I think you were saying about, some of the risk involved with me as the developer. I put my time in this. I released the initial version, which is always the hardest part, arguably, right? And then now I'm into the maintenance period of, even if I don't intend to put any new features in anytime soon, I still got to ship bug fixes. That takes time. Potentially could be costs involved, right? I mean, for example, like you said, the consumer doesn't see the cost, but yet, they're like, well, I didn't get anything. Well, no, but he still got to pay $99 every year to put it in the App Store, right? And I'm not making a user pay for that. That's my expense, right? And I choose to do that. Those costs that the user never sees. Arguably, I would say as a consumer, they should never bother themselves with in many ways, right? You don't go to a store and think to yourself, boy, I wonder how much it costs this store to run the electricity every day. It's not something that enters your head, right? The store just swallows that cost, and maybe they offset it in the value of the product. But what I want to do here is, let's sort of, like you say, we could go on, so let's sort of reel it in a little bit and let's talk about, some of those feelings that you have when someone, because I've never entertained the idea of a subscription. So it's not even entered my head to have an opinion on it from a maker's perspective. But as someone that's now done that, inevitably, kind of suffered the pros and cons, where does that leave you now as far as thinking about it? Because I'm sure, right, every time you read someone says, subscription, well, what the... It hurts, right? You're like, why are you focusing on this instead of, hey, I made this app for you. I didn't make you use it, but you chose to.
So many.
And there's the answer, folks.
Yeah. And
no, I don't want to put you in a corner, but I want to give you an opportunity.
No. I mean, yes, it is a bummer, but at the same time, like, I see it. There is a reason why historically I have not done subscriptions. Yes, I agree. Subscriptions suck. And there's another response in the chat that, like, yeah, subscriptions are feeling like you're being asked to make a long-term commitment to the app. Problem is, I'm also kind of feeling like it's also the opposite. And that's the problem, is like these two things are so much in conflict of, yes, being a subscription is like this big commitment, but at the same time, is it less of a commitment than just the one-time purchase? That's basically a lifetime commitment. But I get why customers feel like, oh, I don't want to make the subscription, and then like I end up having to cut it off, and now I don't have access to the app anymore, and this doesn't work for me. And yeah, I like that. That is the problems that I'm feeling. I kind of understand the arguments from the consumer side, and I understand the arguments from the developer side, and I understand the arguments from both pros and cons on either side of those things. It's like there are pros and cons to the developer, there are pros and cons to the customer, and I don't really know how to square this circle. Is really the problem that I'm running into, and the reason why it comes up. And yeah, it does suck to see somebody say, hey, I'm not going to use this app. I'm not even going to entertain the idea of even beginning to use this app because it's a subscription app and I refuse to use it. There are people who have called me criminal for charging a subscription, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. And yeah, it's a bummer. And I do feel like there is an impact to that. And I think that's why in a lot of cases you see developers get defensive. And that's really what I'm trying to avoid doing on this podcast. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of doing it on this podcast, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to double down and be like, these people are stupid. These people don't understand. These people don't know how hard it is to be a developer. What I want to get across is that, yes, I understand how much that this is a bummer, but I also understand that, like, if I don't do something with how I'm doing my app's business, those apps aren't going to continue to exist. And I know that there are people out there who do really enjoy these apps, and who are in constant communication with me and say, like, I really love this app. I really like what it does. I use this app every day. And I've got to do something in order to continue to provide that to that user. Like, I'm doing something that the user enjoys, and I want to be able to continue to do this thing that the user enjoys. And I just have to reach a balance of, like, I don't want to shut down this app, but I need to be getting some sort of value out of it, as opposed to continuing to work on it, continuing to improve it, continuing to build it, and not really seeing anything from my time as well.
I think my perspective on a lot of this is that there's not actually any problem with subscription or paid upfront, and it is purely a perception issue. And I say that because, like someone says in the chat room, and we've all been there, right? You look one day and you're like, wow, how many subscriptions do I have? Right? And then suddenly you get the sticker shock of it. But at the same time, if you was to ask yourself, okay, let's say these weren't subscriptions and I chose to have them anyway, and I pay it up front, it's the same thing, right? And what I mean by that is, let's assume for a second the cost, the pricing is relative, right? So it's $100, it's $120 upfront or $10 per month for a year. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the same thing. But the perception of paying over time for the year and seeing that hit your credit card every month gives you this false economy in your head that somehow you're paying more because you're continuing to pay over time. But in reality, it's the same thing, right? And on top of that too, right, people happily pay the rising cost every month.
Wouldn't say happily
for streaming service X, Y, and Z, and sure, yeah, and sure they grumble about it, but they keep doing it, right? And that's what I was saying earlier about the consumers getting used to the fact that, hey, software is basically going that way, and it's the same thing. It's only because you're having to adapt to thinking about it that way that somehow you think it's an evil thing. Now, let me preface that by saying I can think of plenty subscription-based apps that have no business being subscription-based whatsoever and very much feel like a money grab. I'm not going to name any of them, but it doesn't take but 5 minutes to look in the store and see that kind of thing when it's clear that it's not with good intention. All right. But I also want to address very quickly one other thing before the chat room scrolls by too quickly. And let me find it here. So, in the chat room, someone mentions about at least giving them the ability for read-only data or a lifetime license. Now, I like a lifetime license, and I've done that on a couple of things. Some of them I still use, some of them I don't, right? But I did it because I thought I might want to use this over time, and inevitably the price will go up and so on. But here's my concern about a lifetime subscription or lifetime payment, whatever you want to call it. That also has a risk, because 6 months from now, if you stop supporting that app, someone's going to say, look, I got a lifetime license here. You need to keep supporting this because I paid for a lifetime license. Right? Any thoughts?
Yeah. No. I do. Yeah.
Say no if you don't.
I mean, my thoughts on that are lifetime unlock isn't going to have that. It's going to have the same problem there as a in-app purchase, a one-time payment thing, whether it's paid up front or in-app purchase. It is. I do see that there's not much difference between those. Like, a lifetime unlock, it's just the subscription thing. The other thing that this chatter says is that cost is going to be 3 to 5 times your annual subscription cost, which is going to be a bit of a sticker shock. And I've had people balk at the price of Bark as it is. It's $5 a year. And they've said that, like, I wouldn't pay more than $3 for this ever. Is it going to just invite more arguments, more negative comments to say, okay, well, you can pay $5 a year or you can pay $20 once, and they're going to go, oh my God, it's $20. You're committing highway robbery for charging $20 for this app. It does feel like a no-win situation for that. To your earlier point that you mentioned of, what do you do with this subscription as well is what do you do when the subscription is done and having a read-only thing. And that is also, again, something that I've tried to communicate with my app is, the subscription is only to add things to this app. Once you have them in the app, you get to keep them. You in your subscription, you're done. You get to have every other remaining feature of this app as for the rest of the app running. But yeah, it's very hard to communicate that. And a lot of people see subscription and they just shut down. Like there's no more explaining anything to that. And that's another problem of like, you also have to get across, here's what the value is, and here is how this ends up when you don't pay the subscription. Like what is the end game of that subscription? And yeah, getting all of that across in a quick and easy way that people are going to read in just a couple seconds, it's difficult to have that kind of pitch.
There is another business model here that I forgot about. As you was talking there, it reminded me of it, which is this idea of the subscription. You get the new features, and then when you stop paying the subscription, you're cut off at that point, and you get everything up to that point, which to me as a developer sounds incredibly hard to maintain. I can't even begin to imagine how you code for something like that, right? But I appreciate that people are trying it.
I've seen it work with some apps. It is one of those things that works way better outside of the App Store because, for example, Sketch, it's a big vector editing app. They have that sort of model, but the way that their model works is you get version updates until you get to until you stop paying the subscription, and at that point you just no longer get updates. That's not something that we can do in the App Store. We can't really say, oh, you're just never getting another software update. I've seen apps do it in the App Store. There's Agenda. It's a note-taking app that they do something similar where there's like, okay, here is your new feature, and you don't get that feature.
Yep.
And I think it would be difficult to build that, but I think that if that is what it takes to make this a sustainable business practice, I think that's worth it. However, I think it gets back to the point that we made a while ago, which is that you then are really trying to push these new features as this is why you need to update. And you get back into the situation of you need to have the big update. And so am I holding back features so that it's something that people have to continue to subscribe to get the update to? It gets right back into that same problem of what is providing a ongoing amount of value to the user and being able to balance that with providing value to the developer.
Time for a break.
Hey everybody, it's Peter Whittam here from the Compulsive Podcast. I'm going to tell you about SetApp. SetApp is a service that provides a subscription fee of just $10 a month, and you get access to over 200 Mac applications, and it's also available now on iOS as part of that deal. I use the service because it just has a ton of really good first-rate apps that I use all the time. And for me, it's invaluable as a developer to have access to tools for things like APIs, for planning projects, writing emails, writing documentation. And you can get all of these things, including database apps, all of that kind of stuff, right there on the SetApp service for just $10 a month. You can use as many or as few applications as you need. If you're interested in checking this out, go to peterwhittam.com, peterwhitham.com/SetApp, SETAPP, and you can see the details there. And it's got a link that you can go over and start using the service and see how it works out for you. I strongly recommend this to every Mac user.
Break time over.
Whether you are charging for an update or charging for a subscription, you definitely have taken on a commitment that you have to honor to provide more value over time. And by that, I don't mean like, oh, I added a new color theme, right? something like that should be an in-app purchase, in my opinion. I'm talking about honest-to-goodness incremental features. Now, on that subject, because you mentioned it, I do have a problem if developers choose to hold back features for some future paid update, or subscription to get them into that. Now, I get it. That's not clear cut. And certainly something almost impossible to prove unless a developer says, oh yeah, I'm holding this back for da, da, da. Then I start to take issue with it a bit. But that's really, in my mind, because I'm now taking issue with the ethical stance of the developer or studio in question, as opposed to their paying model, right? Because if you're going to do that, that just...
But I want to step in, because I feel like that is kind of the point of that model, is you are saying that this is what you're paying for. And if you're not holding it back, then you have to be, you're basically releasing an update and you're saying, please give me more money because I provided you something last week. Like, give me money now because I gave you something already. And it's like, but you already gave me that. Why should I give you the money? So in a case where you're paying for software updates, like, you have to have something in that software update to encourage people to pay for that software update. I don't see that as an ethical problem per se, as just what that business model encourages. If you are not holding back features, then people are going to go, well, what am I paying you for?
Well, so I'm going to give you, okay, this is a bad example in many ways, but in some ways, the perfect example of what I'm talking about. I forget, someone, chat room, keep me honest, was it BMW?
Heated seats.
Charged an extra fee? Yes. That's what I mean by intentionally holding something back to grab.
In that case, it's
a
dollars, thing that,
right? And by the way, at this point,
I think
never
that's
going to
a
get
case
sponsored
where
by
they're charging for something that they already produced.
Yeah.
That's not what I mean by the encouragement of the system. This is, I'm producing something in the future and I'm not releasing it until you have that purchase. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Oh no, I get what you mean. Yeah, it's like this thing does not exist yet. I want it to exist one day, but it doesn't exist yet. To me, intentionally holding something back is something that is ready to ship, right? Is done. And you say, this is so good, I'm going to hold it back for the next major release.
Yeah.
And I get it. It's a grey area. It is a grey area. I get that. We knew going into this discussion, this was going to be a tough one, because we knew we'd come out at the other end with, there is no right answer here. It's simple as that, right? And it's all opinions. But I think, like with so many episodes I've done in the past, by putting opinions out there, it brings it up for discussion. And I think that that's what it needs, right? In our developer communities, we got to discuss these things, right? Because these inevitably are something, especially folks new to the industry, it always inevitably is going to come up, right? It is very much like the Swift UI or UI kit. Well, because inevitably the question of how do you do your pricing? And the answer is you do what feels right to you, or you do it and it's wrong and you do it again. And there is no correct answer, I think. There is just try. And if it works for you and you're comfortable with it, but more importantly, your customers are comfortable with it, then go with that. And if somewhere along the way, the two sides are not meeting, try something different, right? There's nothing that says the one you go with has to be the one forever. But I do want to address something that came up in the chat, because the chat has been suggesting different business models that, hey, maybe Apple could do this, or if they did that. I think that would actually make the situation worse, right? Because I think that, very much like my viewpoint on a lot of the Apple hardware lines, right? The more options you give, the more complicated it gets, the more pissed off your purchaser gets, because I didn't want to have to make all these decisions. I just wanted to get this thing, right? So I don't think more business models is the answer. I think having a simple, whatever, 2 or 3 approaches, and those in the App Store is what works, maybe, as opposed to 500 variations. I think we will see some of this already, where there are so many hard to understand pricing structures on apps. And I've seen ones where they list the same description for each level. And I can't tell what the difference is between the one that cost me $1.99, $5.99, and $10.99, because they all say the same thing. Yeah. It's a very definite line between I want to try and cater for as many users as I can with many different options. But the more options I give them and the more confused they get, the less they're more likely to just walk away from all of them, because they start to feel like, wait, you're trying to capture me in some way. You're trying to trick me, which is not the intention at all. If you confuse the consumer, you start to lose them, and you're going to lose them quickly. Whereas if you can communicate with them, as someone said in the chat room, in a way that they understand, and you give them simple options.
Yeah, and I think that this paradox of choice is the question there is like, yeah, you have the confusing thing, but you also have the ability to get exactly what you want. And well, I mean, yeah, that is the discussion in there. And like with the pricing discussion overall, is there a right answer?
Like I say, for me, it comes down on... You as the developer, figure out what you would like it to be, try it, see if the customer agrees with you. If you're all happy, fantastic. If you're not, try and figure out what it is the customer actually wants. Now, that said though, like in your case, to go full circle back to the beginning here, we also have to recognize the percentage of possible purchasers, users, that you have to ignore, because whatever you do will always be wrong for them. For example, there'll always be that one that says everything should be free. You just have to dismiss that group as good luck, go find yourself another planet, because it ain't going to be this one. And so you have to go in saying to yourself as a developer, distributor of software, there's going to be a certain percentage I'm never going to win over, and I have to accept that. Otherwise, I'm chasing a moving target and I'm still never going to win. I was going to say, I want to throw a question to the chat room. The folks in the chat room who have paid apps. And you don't have to answer this question, but I think it will offer a lot of insight. When you released an app, what did the payment model you wanted to use end up being the one that was successful, or you had to go a different route? All right, so we got one that says it was successful first time. Another failed and succeeded with payment strategies. All right. Okay, and it came down to not understanding the customer. All right, which is something you can learn over time.
All right, Peter. So I think we've been going for quite a while, so we might want to go ahead and wrap this up here. But I feel like we opened this up saying that this is going to be a podcast about pricing. And while we've spent the entire time talking about pricing models, we haven't really gotten into talking about pricing value. What is it that you're actually going to charge? If you've chosen to do a subscription, if you've chosen to do a paid upfront, if you've chosen to do an in-app purchase, what do you actually end up charging? And I think that that's also been a lot of what's been discussed lately in public. And so I think maybe we need to come back next week and have this discussion some more.
All right. So we hope that this episode has given you some food for thought as to the complexity involved with pricing, and how you should think about this, and take into account some of these models as you, the developer, the distributor, whatever role you may play in that process. And I agree with you, Jeff. Let's bring them back next week where we can dive in and talk numbers. Please understand, folks, again, these are our opinions. You should all charge what you feel is appropriate. And if it works for you, great. If it doesn't work, if we don't tell you the number, you can't blame us. All right. So, Jeff, tell folks where they can find you between now and next week when we come back with more worldly advice.
As always, you can find everything that I do at Cocoatype.com. I'm Cocoatype on all the socials, YouTube, Twitch, wherever you find me these days.
All right, and you can find me, of course, at compileswift.com with the podcast, or all my personal stuff at peterwooden.com. Folks, come back next week for part 2. See you later.